Welcome, everyone. My name is Alexa, and I'll be your host today. Thanks for joining us for Avoiding DevOps Anti-Patterns with Jeffery, Payne, and Nathen Harvey.
So welcome, everyone, to Avoiding DevOps Anti-Patterns. My name is Jeff Payne. I am the host of this webinar series. For those of you that don't know me, I'm the CEO and founder of Coveros. Coveros is a consulting company that helps organizations accelerate delivery using Agile and DevOps methods. We provide DevOps implementations, coaching, consulting, and training in those areas. I'm also the editor, the technical editor for Agile Connection, which is an online Agile and DevOps community. Encourage anyone here who's interested in Agile and DevOps to join that community. It's free, and for about 10 years now, TechWell has been publishing content around Agile and DevOps from team level all the way up to enterprise. There's a lot of great articles on there as well. You can also follow me on Twitter at Jeffery E. Payne. I tweet a lot about those subjects as well. I'm happy to have with me today a recognized expert in DevOps, right, Nathen? And I'll let him introduce himself. Nathen Harvey from Google.
All right, thanks so much, Jeff. It's good to see you today. And hello, everyone. As Jeffrey mentioned, my name is Nathen Harvey. I am a cloud developer advocate at Google. I've spent, about the last decade or so in the DevOps space. Prior to joining Google, I have held roles such as VP of Community at a software company called Chef, which you may have heard of. And before that, I was actually building, deploying, operating systems for a company called Custom Inc. And there I was responsible for moving all of our systems out of the data center, our physical data center, and into the cloud, changing some of the ways that we do work and so forth. So I'm super passionate about DevOps and helping you and your teams adopt DevOps practices and principles to deliver better value both to your business and to your customers, all while having a little bit more fun, I hope. You can also follow me on Twitter, and my Twitter handle is there on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. You should be able to see that there.
Thanks, Nathen. Welcome. Happy to have you here today, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of fun as part of this. We want to start off with an audience poll. We've told you a little bit about us. We want to learn a little bit about you, who's here today listening to this webinar. So I'm going to open up a poll. And please put in your primary role in the organization. If your role doesn't fit one of these, just select the other button and put into the chat your role so we know a little bit about you. All right, let me broadcast the results and we'll talk about these quick. Nathen, so it looks like we have a pretty good combination of folks across the spectrum. I'm kind of surprised to see no ops and security folks in this discussion. We're certainly going to be talking about some of that today. Any observations about the audience today?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see, there's a lot of folks that identify as testers, so in the test area. It's good to see that we have both some product owners, or at least one product owner, and some executives along. I think when we talk about DevOps and certainly the anti-patterns that you witness within DevOps in organizations or within organizations around DevOps, I think it's important to remember that it's more than just Dev and Ops. And so it's good to see, while we do have DevOps represented here, we have a wide variety of different backgrounds. So that's super good.
Yeah, and Scrum Master project management as well, which is great. So a little bit of an agenda. We're going to talk real briefly about what is DevOps, some different definitions, and just put some context around the discussion here. Then we're going to dive right into some anti-patterns. Nathen and I are going to cover 8 different anti-patterns that we've seen. Talk a little bit about them, and also about some ways that you might address them or deal with them if you see them in your organization. So we'll provide some tips and techniques on avoiding them and addressing them as we go. We are going to leave some time at the end for Q&A, so please put your questions into the chat as we go. We might not be able to answer them immediately, but we will be sticking around and answering questions for the last 10 minutes or so of this presentation. So what is DevOps? I always start my DevOps talks with this question because it means so many different things to so many different people. Here's one definition that I like personally, and that is DevOps is an approach to getting everyone involved in the software development process, communicating and collaborating so they're all working together. Nathen, how about you? How do you define DevOps, and how does yours differ from this definition?
Yeah, sure, Jeff. I think this is a really great definition, and not dissimilar to you. I have my own favorite definition of DevOps. In fact, just looking at the list of participants, it looks like we have around 50 or so participants. I bet if we polled the room again, we could come up with, let's see, there's 50 of us here, so we could probably come up with 60 different definitions for DevOps. But the one that I always sort of lean on is this. DevOps is a cultural and professional movement focused on how we build and operate high-velocity organizations born from the experiences of its practitioners. So there's a lot of, it's different words, but there's a lot of echoes of your definition in my definition and vice versa. And I think as we start to dig through some of the anti-patterns and some of the, better patterns, both of these definitions will take a little bit more clarity on. And I think one of the, maybe this is the zeroth anti-pattern that we should talk about. I think that there's often this strong debate within organizations about is this work DevOps, is this work not DevOps, and maybe the definition doesn't matter. Maybe it's the outcomes that matter, and let's stop arguing about the definition and let's make forward progress. What do you think about that for our zeroth anti-pattern?
I love
Jeff?
it, because all arrays should start at 0, right? Anybody? I used to have a professor in grad school. He used to say arrays start at 0 where God meant them to start. So he was a little passionate about that, but I totally love the idea of a 0th DevOps pattern. So thank you for that, Nathen. The other thing we should talk about real quick before we dig into the anti-patterns is just to clarify, when we say DevOps, it doesn't just mean dev and ops, and as you're going to see, this is going to bleed into the anti-patterns. There's all sorts of course, other roles in the supply chain that should be part of a DevOps process and part of a DevOps, kind of mindset. And quality, you mentioned testing, Nathen, and quality and availability and performance and all these security are hugely part of the process and important. You want to comment on that and what you've seen out there in terms of people misunderstanding this?
Yeah, for sure. Like I said, I've been around the community for about, for about a decade. And I remember early on in the definition around DevOps and when the movement was really starting to take hold, there were a lot of people in testing and QA that said, hey, it should be Dev QA Ops. You don't get to skip past us. There's still quality that has to be built in and quality that has to be sort of validated before we move out into production. And today you're seeing and hearing things from security teams that are like, hey, we need to be part of this as well. And so I totally agree that the word DevOps, unfortunately, it's not a really great word because when you hear it, you think dev and ops. But the truth is, and for those of us that have been sort of in this movement, I kind of view it as a tent that's large enough for all of us to fit into. And that's part of why my definition talks about building and operating a high-velocity organization. You certainly can't build a high-velocity organization by focusing in on only 2 departments within that organization. It truly is all of us. And so I like this idea of thinking about DevOps as sort of the bookends, right? Maybe it starts in dev, and you could even make the argument that it starts even to the left of dev in that we have to prioritize which work are we going to do. And I know that there are some program and product managers here and executives here. They help us with that determination of what work are we going to prioritize. And it is all of these different portions of security, availability, testing, performance, reliability. All of this plays into DevOps.
It sure does, and unfortunately, because people misunderstand that we're talking about bookends here, sometimes some of the anti-patterns we're going to talk about come about. So let's jump right into the DevOps anti-patterns. The first one we've characterized, I call hashtag DevOps. And this is where the organization views DevOps really only as a marketing slogan. So you can tell if you have this problem because your executives talk about DevOps all the time, but nothing in the organization ever changes. Right? We're still in the same org, in the same groups, doing the same things, but now we're starting to see DevOps appear on our social media channels. We see the word DevOps appear on our marketing collateral. It's clearly looked at as a marketing differentiator, but nothing actually is happening in the trenches. Have you seen this, Nathen? And what do you think about this?
Yeah, I have. So first, I've definitely seen this. Second, the first time I heard DevOps, it's kind of funny. The first time I heard the term DevOps, it was at a conference I was attending, and the speaker on stage said, a hashtag does not a movement make, which is absolutely true. A hashtag does not a movement make, but his words were the words that led me to this term DevOps. And so immediately I started looking for that hashtag on Twitter, and I found a bunch of people in this community. But I certainly agree with you that like an executive sitting on an airplane and reading an article in the in-flight magazine about DevOps, who then comes back to the organization and says, tomorrow we will become a DevOps organization, but nothing actually changes, or we just keep saying the word over and over again, DevOps, 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 until it becomes completely meaningless. Like that's not how we get to DevOps. The way that we get to DevOps, if you will, and it should be clear, it's not a destination, it's absolutely a journey. But the way that you start transforming your organization and bringing on these DevOps practices and principles is really to remember that DevOps is about a bunch of practices. So it's how do we change the work that we're doing? Not just how do we talk about the work that we're doing, but how do we actually change the work that we're doing and think about how are we collaborating, how are we looking across that entire software supply chain.
Do you have some thoughts on how, if you're observing this being the case in your organization, are there ways you think you can get going yourself and in your group to start moving toward DevOps if you're kind of getting the sense that really this is just a marketing slogan right now for your org? What do you do, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think one thing that you can do, maybe just even on your team, is abolish the use of the word DevOps. Make that make it foul language that you don't use in the office. Period. Don't even say that word anymore. Focus in on the work. What are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve? So thinking about things like, how do we move change faster through the system? How do we recover from issues faster or incidents faster? Start thinking about those real metrics and how do we actually improve upon those work. And speaking of metrics, that's another great way to sort of quash this as simply marketing or technical speak or jargon within our organization. Let's think about what are those real metrics? How can we start measuring them? And talking about the outcomes, talking about them, how we're impacting these particular metrics.
I love that idea because we do get hung up on words, and to your point, we ought to be focusing on what our result is. What's the business result we're looking for out of any of these things, Agile, DevOps, anything. So the next anti-pattern we want to talk about is, I call DevOps silos, right? Our goal in DevOps is to break down the silos between all the different pieces of our software supply chain. Unfortunately, a lot of organizations are creating a new silo. It's called DevOps. And some early warning signs that maybe you're doing this, you start seeing people pop up with DevOps titles. So vice president, or now you have a DevOps division, or, our goal is to break them down, not to add new ones. Have you seen this, Nathen? And what do you think about this particular anti-pattern?
Well, I've definitely seen it. Look, Jeff, Dev isn't talking to Ops. Ops isn't talking to Dev. I know how we solve this. We'll put a DevOps team in the middle. That's we'll break down the silos by creating another silo. That, to me, definitely feels like the wrong approach. But I think that, I think this does happen. I think that sometimes, while this is an anti-pattern to just stand up a separate organization that's going to be sort of the go-between, sometimes this is an appropriate approach. Sometimes the ways of working and the mistrust and the lack of collaboration across those teams is such that we need someone to come in and show us how to do it. And so sometimes it's appropriate to create a small team that's maybe going to work on a particular project or a particular function, and maybe call that team the DevOps team, but allow them the time and space to do the work in the new way. Sort of be the leaders and sort of show the other teams how to work. So it's important that silo, that DevOps team, if you will, be a team that's responsible for its own sort of workflow or its own workload. How do we move this application forward, and not just used as a go-between between Dev and Ops?
Yeah, that's a great point. I often call it a skunk works, right? Because people think of that as a temporary kind of a focused initiative that you're trying to get something going. I totally agree with you. In the DevOps work we do, we usually are brought in because the organization doesn't feel like they're being successful getting everybody working together and putting in place, once you get your practices and processes straightened out, some tooling to support it, and then onboarding the teams. Yeah, you're going to have to do that temporarily as a group, but then you got to quickly get it to everybody else. I totally agree with you that it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to lapse into it being a permanent silo, but just be really careful, right? It's like the federal government. Every time we add something, it never goes away, right? We all know that. It doesn't matter what country we live in. Our organizations are like that too. If we add a new group, it's going to be hard to get rid of it.
Absolutely. And Jeff, I don't know if I'd call it my favorite. Maybe my most memorable story of DevOps Silos is one time I was talking to a CIO, and he was very proud of the work that he and his team were doing. And I have to say, the team was doing some good work, but I did have to question him because he said, we practice DevOps here. I have developers, I have operators, and I have a QA team. You know what I do? Anytime there's an outage, I go to the QA team and I say, who's to blame? Is this developer's fault or was it operations' fault? That's how we do DevOps here. And I think he kind of missed some of the key learnings of DevOps. That's why it's my, in air quotes, favorite story about DevOps Silos.
That's awesome. Well, not awesome, but that's a good story.
Yes, it's a good facepalm story.
So our third anti-pattern we want to talk about is DevOps equaling tools. We all know automation and tools can help our process, right? It can speed up and accelerate manual processes that just are too slow to get, help us get value to customers. It can be less error prone if we do it right. But the reality is tools are not DevOps. And what's your philosophy on this, and how do we best leverage tools? What are some of the best practices?
Yeah, I think it's super true that tools, especially as you start your DevOps journey, some of the tools that you're going to adopt first maybe are tools around automation. So how do you do maybe infrastructure as code or start building pipelines for your releases? And the beautiful thing about those tools and sort of taking those processes and putting them into tools so that you can programmatically execute them is twofold. One, you can do them much faster with less human intervention. And number two, you can do them much more consistently. But when you think about automating, you also have to think about maybe we shouldn't automate the practice as it is today. Because maybe the practice that we have today fails often or isn't really efficient. All we're going to do is make it faster and more consistent. So if you see consistently that your deploys end up causing incidents and you roll them back, if you automate that pipeline as is, what you're going to end up with is it's going to be easier and faster to break production more consistently. That's not really what we want. But the other thing that's important to remember is that the tools, using new tools alone isn't enough. I often talk about, if I look back on my history and sort of the history of the industry, when we think about things like version control systems, many of us that have been around for a while used CVS or Subversion, and then eventually we moved to Git. And if you think about it, that was changing out the tool, but it also changed our approach and sort of our philosophy for how we do things like branches, who gets to see or have access to the entirety of the repository, we increase trust across that. And that really was cultural change that we were bringing into the organization. And it is true that most organizations, when they first made that switch from Subversion to Git, they started using Git as if it were Subversion. So it's just a new tool, we're going to use it in the same way. So again, just like with automation, that bringing in a new tool is a great opportunity to think about what is the new tool, what is the new process that we want to bring in, and how can the tool help us further that process. So while it's true, DevOps does not equal tools, it is also true that your tools reinforce and amplify the culture and the process that you have within your organization. And it's also true, of course, that your culture and your process within your organization are going to reinforce and amplify the tools. So they're kind of in this circular pattern where they're both lifting each other up and pushing each other forward. And so I think it's important to remember that while the tools aren't the thing that give you DevOps, changing your tooling is probably something that you're going to do along the path. And it's certainly easier to measure the adoption of a tool than the change of a culture. But remember that the two go together, and tools alone simply are not enough.
First of all, you're not allowed to say CVS and Subversion in the same sentence, Nathan. That is not fair. You can put CVS with SCCS if you want to get really geeky old, but you can't put Subversion in there, man. That's not fair.
That's not fair. All right, fair. Mea culpa.
But to your point, I always say a fool with a tool is still a fool. And the whole idea there is, of course, that you've got to get smart about your process, and you've got to make sure you're following a good process, or you're just going to get bad results faster. And I think that's what you're getting to, and it is really important. Do you have any advice on, I mean, what you were saying was you certainly can leverage tools to make change. Are there particular tools or processes that you typically try to or think are important to automate first? Any advice or guidance to the audience on maybe where to start with tools? Or is it so context specific that you can't really say?
Well, I think there are some things that we can generalize. I think first and foremost, look, I don't care if you call it CVS, Subversion, Git. If you're not using a version control system, start there. Like, that is the first thing that you do. Every piece of code, every configuration file that you're writing, if it's not stored in a proper version control system, that's where you start. That is the tool that you start with. And also, just so everyone is aware, a proper version control system, a wiki is not that. So your wiki is not the place to put your code and all of your configurations. It has to go in a proper version control system. But beyond that, what I would do is come back to some of the things that we talked about earlier. Think about the metrics that you're trying to achieve, right? Are you trying to achieve faster recovery times when there are incidents? Are you trying to achieve faster change deployments? And those things can help you identify where do we need to leverage some new tooling. So maybe a good place that I see, or a place that I see a lot of people start, is with infrastructure as code. So how do we automate the spinning up and spinning down and configuration of all of our infrastructure? And then there are also oftentimes heavy investments in the deployment pipeline. So how do we ensure that as a change moves closer and closer to production, we have better confidence that that change is going to be the right thing when it lands in production. Sometimes that means investing in the pipeline itself. Sometimes that means investing in the testing and the verification of that pipeline. Sometimes it means all of those things. And then when it comes to sort of recovering from incidents faster, do you have the right observability? Do you have the right insights into your production environment? And as a team, are you responding appropriately and learning from those incidents? So just to quickly summarize, I think start with version control. If you're not using proper version control, leave the webinar now and just go study up on that. But then beyond that, some obvious choices to help you get started. Look at your deployment pipeline. Look at your testing frameworks that you're using across that entire deployment pipeline. Look at the observability and monitoring capabilities that you have in your production environment. And then look at your incident response and sort of learning from failure or learning from incidents processes and tools that you're using internally. Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, no, but that'll get people rolling, that's for sure. I like that. The anti-pattern number 4 is DevOps equals Agile. There is certainly a relationship between the Agile principles and the DevOps kind of 3 ways, if you will, from the Gene Kim book, and all the thought process around self-directed teams and things like that. But they're not the same thing, right? There is a difference between Agile and DevOps, and you know, I have a colleague that says something that I always think is appropriate. I always used to say that DevOps is the extension of Agile principles into operations. I believe that is partially true. But he always says that DevOps delivers on the promises that Agile made, because Agile was about, you know, getting more value to customers faster. But unfortunately, in most Agile processes, we forgot about delivery. You want to comment, and what are your thoughts on this anti-pattern?
Yeah, so my first comment is I don't believe that the people that sat down and wrote the Agile Manifesto and signed on to that were intentionally excluding operations and delivery from their Agile Manifesto. But I do think in practice, I see a lot of what you just described. Agile and all of our focus on Agile has helped our developers get closer to the business and therefore closer to the customer, and also has helped our developers turn out features faster. But in practice, what happens is that it kind of ends there, and then we get blocked by operations. And actually, DevOps, you know, if you go all the way back to the sort of the foundations and the origin of the word DevOps, the person that coined the word actually started really thinking and talking publicly about this process at an Agile conference, where he proposed a birds of a feather session called Agile Infrastructure. And from those initial conversations, this idea of DevOps was born. So I think that DevOps and Agile certainly are different. DevOps absolutely is taking Agile to a next step. We're building on top of Agile. DevOps also learns from other sort of practices and industries as well. DevOps, you talked about the 3 ways, and of course, feedback is one of those big ways. DevOps takes a lot from lean manufacturing or just the lean movement in general. So I think that DevOps, is built on top of and is informed by Agile. It's informed by lean, and it's informed by a bunch of other areas of study and areas of practice.
That's great. And if anybody's interested, there is a great video out there that Patrick Dubois did talking about that first interaction at that conference you mentioned. I think the story goes that someone, and I can't remember who it was, proposed that birds of a feather. He showed up, and the person who proposed it wasn't even interested enough in the topic to show up themselves.
Yes,
and then he tracked that person down, and they had this conversation during the conference and started getting passionate about this. It's a really great video, and it's out there on YouTube somewhere if you want to, check it out.
Yep, and if anyone wants to just to complete some of the missing details there, it was Andrew Clay Schaefer, and if you'd like to follow him, he's Little Idea on Twitter. So he proposed the topic and then thought no one would show up, and it was Patrick Dubois who showed up. They eventually met, and then about 10 years ago, the first DevOps Days was held, and Patrick organized that.
Yep. Great story. AntiPatterns number 5, devs doing ops. All right. So a lot of people think that the idea with DevOps is that your developers ought to be doing operations, and that's a struggle, quite honestly. I mean, developers were not meant to necessarily focus on operations. That's not their specialty, and I've found it gets people in trouble when they start thinking about DevOps like this. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that DevOps and sort of the DevOps movement kind of came into its own right around the same time that cloud was starting to be widely adopted. And I think at that time, right, as DevOps was coming out and as cloud was being widely adopted, developers were getting frustrated because they couldn't get their systems, their changes into production as fast as possible. But it was very easy for them to throw down a credit card and get on-demand infrastructure. And so initially, devs did start picking up some ops work, some traditional ops work, so that they could get their code out into production. But what actually happens is that it turns out that operations is a specialty, and we need specific skills and a specific mindset to operate systems. And it's not just about provisioning those systems and getting the code onto it. It's about how does that code run over time. And so the idea that devs should do ops, I think that's flawed. I think that devs have to understand the operational characteristics of their applications. They do have to take a little bit more ownership around what happens to my application in production and what can I learn about my application from listening to ops, from observing it in production. But asking devs to do ops or saying, you know what, we got rid of our developers, we got rid of ops, now everyone is DevOps, everyone does everything, that is a flawed system.
It sure is. And, you hear the term, shadow IT, right? You were kind of characterizing it, which is where development doesn't feel like they're getting the support they need from operations. And so they just decide they're going to do it themselves in the cloud. We actually had a customer, we ran into this problem with a customer who wanted an MVP done on a new system, and we couldn't get corporate IT. It was a huge insurance company to commit to setting up the environments we needed within the time frame of the MVP. They just weren't structured to do that. And so we, along with our sponsor, had to build a shadow IT capability for the MVP, but then, work to roll it back in after, after we finished, basically determining the viability. But to your point, I think I found that when developers get engaged and involved and start trying to do ops, they find out how difficult of a job that actually is to do and how much time it takes.
Absolutely. So what's AntiPatterns number 6,
Number 6
Jeff?
is ops doing development. So the other thing you see is people in the operational viewing DevOps as automation, right? We talked about it, tools and automation, and thinking that the organization thinking that the operational people should become developers. And while it is common for ops personnel to be able to script and automate some of the manual stuff that they do to make it more efficient, we don't want operational personnel to try to become software developers, in my opinion. Do you agree? And have you seen this in action?
Yeah, I've definitely seen this in action, and I definitely agree. I think that, operations itself, the practice of operations, is a specialized skill, and the people that are really good at that and sort of gravitate to that work should stay doing that work. But I do think that as operators, there's a lot that we can learn from developers and software development practices. I talked earlier about infrastructure as code and building better pipelines. These maybe are operational concerns, but they're definitely bringing different and newer tooling to our operators. And so I think that operators can stand to learn a lot from good software development practices. As you mentioned, many operators are great at scripting, but the other sort of side of that is many traditional system administrators kind of walk around with a pocket full of bash scripts or a toolbox of bash scripts or PowerShell scripts or what have you that they hold to themselves. They aren't collaborating on those with other people. They aren't necessarily sharing that work. And so this idea of how do you do good software development practices? How do you use version control systems? How do you write automated tests against these things? These are all things that operators need to start embracing in this new sort of modern IT world. The other thing that I think is really interesting is that this idea that ops should be doing dev or dev should be doing ops, what this actually is a signal to us that this is a great collaboration opportunity. As an operator, I might understand my systems really well, but maybe not the good coding practices or coding frameworks. As a developer, I know those coding practices and frameworks, but I may not understand the systems very well. Well, what if we sat down and did some pair programming on some of our operational tasks? What if we sat down and collaborated on infrastructure as code? In doing so, as an operator, I can learn much more about good software development practices. And as a developer, you can learn much more about the operational environment in which your applications are running. Because, as a developer, typically your application runs on your laptop or on your workstation. Your customers don't care about it there. That's just where you spend all of your time. So working together and collaborating here, I think, is a great opportunity for us to really start, again, changing how we work and really moving down this journey of DevOps.
When you talk about dev and ops pairing, I get excited because it's the same challenge we have traditionally with dev and test, right? Trying to get them to collaborate and work together and understand that what they do is very interrelated. And it's the same thing with what you're describing for dev and ops. So I really like that idea of using pairing as a way to maybe break down those barriers.
Absolutely. And it doesn't actually end with just writing the code. If you think about this in reverse, let's think about what happens with operations. How can dev pair with ops to learn more about operations? One of the things that operations is typically responsible for is incident response and incident management. Well, after you have a big incident, you should be following that up with a postmortem or some sort of learning review, some opportunity for you to learn from that incident. And unfortunately, developers aren't always invited or included in those postmortem discussions or those learning reviews. This, again, is a great opportunity to increase that collaboration. Let's bring the developers into that conversation. They're going to come with new perspective and a new idea about how do we make the systems more reliable. And so I think that as you look at ops doing dev and dev doing ops, yes, there's absolutely some overlap. But really, the way I like to talk about it is we are well-connected specialists. We aren't generalists, but well-connected specialists.
I like that. That's great. AntiPattern number 7 is starting with an org chart. So we all know that as part of your transformation process to DevOps, that you're probably going to change how the organization interacts and works. But you don't start with that, right? Where do you start, in your opinion? And have you seen this issue, and what was kind of the impact of this you've seen in places?
Yeah, for sure. I think if you go back to that executive that saw an article about DevOps on the In-Flight magazine and came home and said, let's do DevOps. We're going to start with an org chart change. Let's figure out what does the organization need to look like. Look, I don't know about you, Jeff, but every place I've worked, when there's an org change, it's a tough time for everyone in the organization. we all like change or talk about liking change, but changing how we work at an organizational level is really, really difficult. And there's a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt that comes into that when you have to suffer through an org change. So I think trying to change how you work by starting from a place of fear and uncertainty is the wrong way to go. I think it is important that what we do is we identify maybe a particular application or a particular workload that we want to start adopting these DevOps principles with, and we pull together a cross-functional team, someone from development, someone from operations, maybe someone from networking, a product owner, and so forth. And we pull this team together and we step back. We give them the autonomy that they need and the space to just stay focused on that particular function or workload or piece of functionality and figure out how do we do this in a better way that's more collaborative. We start there with one project team maybe, and then we start to spread that throughout the organization. And I'd much rather discover through work what is the right organizational structure than to start by just forcing an organizational structure onto a team where we don't even know that that organizational structure is going to work well. So again, in my definition, I talk about building and operating a high-velocity organization. I think HR is an important part of our DevOps movement. Can you have teams that come together, that sort of self-forming teams? Are those allowed within your organization? And the other thing I think that's so critical and important and often overlooked, wherever possible, put those teams, co-locate those teams. Have your developers sit with your operators. Have your QA team sitting with that team and the product owner. Put them all in the same physical room wherever you possibly can.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think something related to this that maybe we want to talk about for a minute is scaling models, right? Because that's the other thing you often see people plop into place and hope that they've got some way to basically tell everybody what their new job is in this, top to bottom infrastructure. And that's that's like an org chart, right? I mean, it's not called an org chart, but it's kind of aligning and telling people where they fit, and that's dangerous to start with, right? I've seen challenges with that versus starting with your teams, getting your teams to be successful, and then figuring out how they need to collaborate and communicate to make the entire organization successful.
Absolutely, and I think you need that executive buy-in to provide the cover and the space and to allow the team to work in an autonomous way and figure it out for themselves. But the people on the ground doing the work are the ones that best understand how that work needs to change, are the ones that are most likely to discover the successful patterns in how to work together. It's not people sitting far away, either organizationally far away, whether that's vertically or horizontally, but it's the people that are doing the work that are going to discover that. And part of DevOps is iteration, right? We're going to make a small change, we're going to see how it goes, and then we're going to adjust to that. We're going to get that feedback cycle. And so we can't just do that with our computer systems. We have to do that with the entire system, which of course includes the people.
That's great. Yeah, totally agree. AntiPattern number 8 is outsourcing DevOps. So this is turning it over to somebody else to run, to own, to manage, whatever. I've seen this not work well. What have been your experiences?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things here. First, there's a DevOps consultancy, we can just give everything to them. The challenge with that, frankly, is that the people that you're outsourcing that work to, they aren't necessarily working against or towards the same goals or working for the same objectives. They have a different set of incentives, and really aligning our incentives is the way that we get to a successful DevOps adoption and really start changing out the way that we work. The other thing that's true, when you think about how do we change our organization, you could certainly hire someone from the outside to come in and help you change your organization, but what those people from the outside don't have any understanding of today is how your systems work today. What's the political climate and nature within your organization? The people that you have on your team right now are the ones that are most equipped to be able to do that. And absolutely, it is undeniable that they may need some coaching. They may need some new skills in terms of tools that they're going to use. But it's the team that you have on site in your house right now. That's the team that is best equipped to take your movement forward and to get you towards these outcomes that you're looking for. Bring in some coaches, bring in some new ways of learning, bring in somebody to help them skill up on some things, but you can't just replace them or outsource all of that transformation that you need to happen.
Yeah, two thoughts on that. So you're hitting close to home when you talk to me about DevOps consulting, because that's what we do at Coveros. But to your point, we don't consider ourselves to be outsourcers, and never have. We call it enablement, right? Our job is to come in and figure out where the gaps are in what you have and what you're doing, where you might need some short-term help, some coaching, some training. Maybe you need an MVP built along with your team to demonstrate how to use new tools or new capabilities. But we view our job is to get you set up so we can go away, right? I mean, when software is eating the world, as Mark Andreessen put it very adaptly, you have to own IT and software. I passionately believe there are very few companies in the world today that shouldn't be looking at software development as a strategic piece of their business. And you don't outsource strategy, right? That's what's so frustrating about some of the companies out there is they're outsourcing their future, right? And the second point is, and I love your comment, if you read the Accelerate report, right, by Dora, they talk about the fact that low-performing DevOps organizations are 4 times as likely to be outsourcing functions, whether it's dev or test or ops or whatever. They're 4 times as likely versus the high performers. That tells you something. There's a correlation between, kind of outsourcing your strategy and your ability to be successful with DevOps. What do you think of that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to your point, I think Coveros is great at becoming coaches and learning facilitators. But I know from the work that I've seen and heard about you doing that you don't go in to do the work. You go in to help do the work. You might be part of the team on a temporary basis, and that is absolutely beneficial and can really help sort of take big steps for that organization. But the truth of the matter is, it's the team on the ground that has to do the work. And I absolutely agree, excuse me, as well. The research that the DORA team, that's the DevOps Research and Assessment team, has done, has identified that outsourcing these key functions it absolutely is a key indicator that you are likely to be a low-performing IT team. And every company is a software company or is on their way to becoming one. And it is supremely important that you understand the business of your business and the business of how you can leverage software to bring that to push forward your business value and your customer value.
Yep, that's great, Nathen. So we want to find out from you all, and we'll jump over and do a poll. Any of you have these problems or challenges in your organization? You can click multiple anti-patterns. Just pick the ones you feel like your organization, unfortunately, is dealing with right now, and that you're looking or seeking advice on how to fix. Kind of curious. And we'll let people vote. You can vote on any and all. We also put other as a category, because if there's some we didn't cover or anything that you're seeing that you think is an anti-pattern, click the other and put it into the chat window, and we do have time for questions, and we'll try to address that as part of the Q&A.
You mentioned that maybe it's unfortunate that you are suffering through these anti-patterns, and while yes, that is unfortunate, it's also I think you're taking the right step by being very clear about, hey, these are some of the anti-patterns that we are currently experiencing. That gives you a good insight into what are the things that we need to go and start improving on. So one of the sort of principles of DevOps is that we learn from our failures. And so really being intentional about thinking about which of these patterns are impacting us, that will help you get on the path to addressing them.
Absolutely. And learning from other people, right? I like learning from their failures too. It hurts a lot less, right? So, I mean, the other thing is sharing all this will give you an idea of what other people are struggling with, and you're going to find a lot of people are struggling with the exact same thing that you are. Why don't we go ahead and share the broadcast results so everybody can see it? Let's take a look at these, Nathen, and boy, a couple of them. DevOps Silos a biggie, it looks like.
Yeah, that's certainly not a surprise that the silos are big. I also just, what else jumps out? The two other, towards the top are DevOps Tools. And starting with the org chart, I think that, we all get to experience this, probably not for better, but for worse, throughout a number of our organizations. And I love the point that you made there, Jeff, about we can learn from one another. This is something, collaboration has always been a key principle within DevOps. And the thing that I love about it most is that we aren't talking, we're certainly talking about collaboration within organizations, but the way that the DevOps movement has like how it started and how it's grown over the past decade, it truly is collaboration across organizational boundaries as well. So we are trying to and actually learning from one another across those organizational boundaries.
That's awesome. A couple people did check other. So Kevin said a bit of a carryover from Agile. We don't have to worry about process anymore. Certainly seen that, right? I hear we don't have to worry about quality anymore as well, right? It's all about speed. We hear that a lot.
Yeah, for the process thing, I would absolutely say that, it's people first. DevOps is not necessarily super process focused. We start with the people, but we know that people, then process, then tool. That's how we get this job done.
Then another one, Gene mentioned with a customer, they're adding process for safety since DevOps is moving things faster. So they're trying to put a govern on the DevOps process, which is an interesting thing, right?
I think it's fascinating. I also think that if you mentioned the research of Dora, and if you go and look at that research, one of the other key findings that they had there was that actually in order to be safer, you have to move faster. Safety and speed move together both forward and backwards. And the truth is, like, as you continue to automate things, you're going to be able to do things faster, which also means that you're doing them safer. If you think about an organization that is extremely risk averse, and what they do is they're always putting blockers into getting change, say, from the developer's workstation out into production, that organization recognizes that they have a security vulnerability in production. They need to react quickly to that, to remediate that vulnerability. And unfortunately, they just don't have the muscles. They don't have the experience within the organization. What does it mean to move fast? So it is important that we focus on both speed and stability. And the truth is, through the research and by learning from other teams, we'll see that these two are moving together.
Yep, very good point. Or we're going to do some Q&A. But before we do that, for those that are interested in learning more, there are some virtual learning opportunities, some DevOps classes coming up. TechWell has a host, of course, of conferences coming up as well that focus on DevOps, DevSecOps, testing in that arena, continuous testing, and some courses available for both leaders and practitioners in DevOps. So check those out if you find any of those of interest. We also would encourage everybody to join the TechWell Hub. If you're not familiar with the Hub, it's a Slack-based community where you can ask questions like we're asking right here in the webinar, and experts will answer them. Your peers and colleagues will answer them. I know, Nathen, you've done takeovers on the Hub talking about DevOps and things like that. I've done one as well. I encourage people, it's free, it's for the community, and it's to carry on conversations like we're having here and in a continuous way. Instead of it stopping at the end of the webinar, keep it going on the Hub. And I'm sure Nathen and I will be tooling around over there and can answer additional questions after we finish with the webinar. So with that, we'd like to take questions. We have about 10 minutes here to answer questions people have. Alexa, you want to read off anything that you see that's good for us to answer?
Sure. Our first question is from Michael Sowers. He said he loved the anti-patterns that you guys presented and that he's seen and experienced many of them. What's your view on how to make and get to the key outcomes in the context of DevOps when teams are highly distributed?
That's a good one. Nathen, you have thoughts on that?
That's a good one. Yeah, I do have thoughts on that. It's actually a great follow-up from what you just mentioned. Like, look, go to Slack and join the TechWell Hub, right? I think when you have distributed teams, I think there are kind of two different approaches that you can take. One approach is to embrace the distributed nature of your team, which means changing your culture. It means doing things like having Slack or some other sort of group communication that you start embracing. And you encourage the people that even if they're sitting in the same room to move some of those conversations into that group chat setting so that those conversations become visible and open and accessible to people that aren't necessarily in the room. I think other tooling that you start to introduce are things like video chat. It is important in a distributed team that I can look view, look eye to eye at the person that I'm speaking with. I think it's hugely important. I think that you see so many teams that are distributed that default to phone only or audio only as the way of group communication when they get into a meeting or so forth, but video is so important. I think the other thing that's important about distributed teams and meetings is that every meeting should be binary. Either we're all in person or it's one human to one video screen. Everyone is remote on a distributed team. So that's one way that you can address this. Embrace and be very intentional about the distributed nature of your team. The other thing that you can look at, though, is looking at where do we have pockets of people, and maybe what we can do is build feature or delivery teams that are all localized. So while the team as a whole or the organization as a whole might be distributed, maybe we can have teams that are co-located working on a particular piece of functionality, a particular application, or so.
Yeah, that is the way. If you're going to do team-based work, you should structure it, right? I mean, you want full teams, ideally in each area or geographic region you have. One of the things I found it useful with distributed teams, you mentioned using video, Nathan, and totally agree with that, is it is worth a little bit of investment up front for a new team to all get together, at least for a little bit of time, because then when you see that person on the other side, you've built a little bit of a connection with them because you've spent some time with them. It just makes everything flow and collaborate better, I've found, if you've spent a little bit of a time together as before you went distributed, so to speak. Have you noticed that?
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's something that we have to remember all the time, and it's not just as the team gets started, because what happens over time is more people join the team. Of course, we can't necessarily bring everyone back together every time there's a new hire, like let's all spend 2 weeks together because there's a new hire on the team, but it is important for those new people joining your team, whether they're new hires or transfers into your team, it doesn't really matter, but they have to have someone that they can sit shoulder to shoulder with to really understand how the team dynamic works and so forth. And then when your team is distributed, it is important that you get that team together in the same physical location on a regular basis. And I can't tell you what that regular basis is. It should not be any more infrequent than annual, and certainly something like quarterly or twice a year can help. And then the other thing that I think is really important, even on distributed teams, I think we have to try to remember some of the things that we do when we get together in person. And so I think about my time working in an office, like there's often time spent at the water cooler or going out to lunch together. How can you bring that into your video chat? Maybe, and I've done this before with teams, maybe you schedule a video chat-based happy hour. Everyone can bring their own drink, whatever beverage they prefer, to the happy hour, show up and just get together and share a moment of being social with one another. Because again, it's about the people. And so if I know you as a human first, then it's much easier to work together towards a common goal.
That's great advice. You have another question, Alexa?
Yes, Celeste says, as an enterprise coach, I hear in almost every organization I've coached, from the CIO/IT leaders down to the teams, you cannot enable a culture of DevOps and ERP, such as in SAP and Dynamics. How are you busting these myths to move from that fixed mindset?
Any thoughts on that, Nathan? Have you dealt with that?
I think that the most important thing there is, again, to come back to the metrics. So what metrics are we trying to move on? We want to look at maybe how long does it take for code to go from commit to deploy. So in the terms of an ERP system, how long does it take for a configuration to be rolled out across the entire system? And unfortunately, what we're doing, or what I've seen in practice, and I will admit it's been a long time since I've worked on ERP systems, but we do these giant releases, right, where we have maybe 18 months between releases of these systems. We have to get to a place where we can do much smaller releases. And that might be the best place to start with an ERP system. How do we roll out smaller changes more frequently so that we can move safer?
Yeah, and this is exactly an example, perhaps, Nathan, of, you were talking about the fact that, considering tools to be DevOps is certainly an anti-pattern, but tools can help enforce change. What I've seen with the ERP systems is they don't lend themselves necessarily to the use of our traditional CI/CD pipeline capabilities. Now, I know that some of the vendors in that space are building that kind of capability to enable more incremental development over time. But I mean, I feel your pain, the person who asked the question, because we have run into lots of organizations who are struggling with, how do I do some of these things in a situation where I can't really incrementally work the way I'd like to because of the environment that I live in. But it is changing, and I think as those tools improve, you'll see the process in the ERP world change and improve as well.
I think there's something else here, Jeff, where maybe two things. I think as a user of those tools, you have a little bit of power. You should be pushing those vendors to give you functionality that allows you to move in a more incremental fashion. But the other thing that I think we've touched on that's super important, we've talked about collaboration. And as I mentioned, it's collaboration not only within your organization, but across organizational boundaries. And I know many people view their ERP system, and specifically the data within their ERP system, that is core to their business. We don't talk about that with anyone else. However, if you step away from the data that's in there in your particular business process, you can absolutely learn from one another and go talk to each other about how are you rolling out incremental changes? How are you tightening up those feedback loops? How are you adopting those DevOps practices? And so I would encourage you to go to the vendor conferences, reach out on the vendor forums, push that vendor to build you systems that are more easily automatable and easier to roll out incremental changes, but also find out who are the other customers of that. Get them along, and many voices will lead to change within those tools.
Great. Thanks, Nathan. Next question, Alexa?
Sure. We have a question from Jean. How do you deal with other organizations, which can be sometimes other orgs or other contracts, that won't consider themselves part of the DevOps transformation, so they become the blockers for getting things done, such as with security, infrastructure, etc.?
Yeah, so this is back to what we started with, Nathan, the kind of, defining DevSecOps or DevTestOps, or I actually had someone at an event I was attending get up and say, my organization has moved beyond DevOps. We're now doing Biz, Dev, Test, SecOps. You can believe that someone would get up and say that. But what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I think, I certainly see this all the time. There are folks and teams that are definitely resistant to change. I think it's important that we understand where is that resistance coming from. And oftentimes I see that resistance coming from a place of fear. You're asking me to move faster with new tools that I don't understand. That gives me fear. I am afraid of that. I'm losing control. So I think we need to address that head on. And then the other thing that's true is sometimes or oftentimes within those teams, what you can find is an individual on that team who is frustrated with the way things are working now, and or who really wants to adopt the new practices and tooling. And so I say go look for those hand raisers. Hey, who wants to come along on this DevOps journey? The manager or some leadership within that security team may say, not me, not me, not me. But I bet you'll find a security engineer who raises their hand and says, yes, I want to understand what this new world is like. I want to come along for the journey. And bring that person along, give them the experience, and then learn from them, because they understand the language of the team that they're coming from and how to tell the story properly to the team that they're coming from. And they can become your strongest ally and advocate.
Well, to your point about getting dev to learn about ops and understanding what ops does and how it works and using that to hopefully build software that's easier to maintain and support. Same thing with security, right? I mean, we need to get developers and testers early in the process understanding security if we're going to build security in. And in today's environment where privacy and security is so critical to organizations, pushing that back into the life cycle is critical.
Absolutely.
Do we have any other questions?
I don't see any other questions, but Celeste did say, thank you for validating my coaching practice. Everything you stated is exactly what is happening. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, then we'll thank everybody again. Thanks for attending. And we do these periodically, these webinars. Feel free to keep in touch. Move this conversation to the hub, and we'll keep talking there as things come up. But thanks again, everybody, for attending.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I really enjoyed this, and please do join us in the hub and share your anti-patterns. What are the challenges that you're facing within your organization? And let's all help one another move our DevOps journey forward.
Great. Thanks, Alexa.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Nathan. And for everyone who's still online, keep an eye out for your email this afternoon. We'll have a special thank you going out to everyone who attended.